Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Future of XYZ. Today, we are going to be speaking about a favorite topic of mine, which is architecture and the future of architecture. We are privileged to have two guests today, Elizabeth Kubany, who is the founder of Kubany LLC, which is a full-service communications firm specialized in architecture, design, and art. And we have Stephen Cassell, who is a founding principal at Architecture Research Office, which is a full-service design firm, architectural design firm, who does projects, award-winning projects, I should include, across art and public works and education and many other areas. So thank you both for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Lisa, could I just mention that you said Cassell and not Cassell? I don't know if we want to read.
Cassell. Stephen Cassell. I asked to say it correctly and I get it wrong.
Okay.
It's like,
okay, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. It's an amazing thing how our brains can get hardwired to whatever we have our default. And I guess that's leads us nicely into, the default of what we all think about architecture. I think it's so out of touch for so many people. They think of it as an art. I mean, first and foremost, and yet it's around us all the time. So what is the future of architecture? I mean, what's it all about?
It's such a big, great question. And I've had so much fun thinking about it with Stephen over the last couple of weeks. I think the future of architecture actually requires us to really redefine the way we think about architecture. I think most people just think of architecture as buildings, right? Individual buildings, many of them sculptural works of art, as you said, rather than instruments of social change and ecological survival, frankly. And that's really the way we should be thinking about architecture. And I think that, in changing that definition, that therein lies the future of architecture.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to realize that whether you like it or not, architecture is a frame for culture, and it represents things, and it can represent negative things and positive things. But we invest so much money in the built environment around us, and it has such a incredibly large impact on climate change, negative impact on climate change, both from the materials that make up buildings to the energy that they use, that we really have to rethink the goals of what architecture is, not just to enact social change, but to really realize that it has to do 5 or 10 different things to the benefit, not just of the people it's designed for, but to the larger benefit of society.
Well, I love that. I mean, I have to say, I'm sitting in my apartment, which has always had these big, vast views. And I have a building that is now going up, and it's going up so quickly. I'm in downtown Brooklyn, and it's just construction zone nonstop. My building was one of them, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But this building that I'm watching, and many of them are like this, it's going to be 80 some odd stories tall, and they're doing like 6 floors a week. And what you see in all these buildings is just this like constant input of concrete, of cement trucks going in, and you're like, none of these things feel like they're being built to last for a future. Like old construction used to be built for a future, and you can retrofit. And these buildings now feel like they're for the moment. So to your point, like, is that democratized design, or what is that? How does that play into this idea of like, social change and environmental, survival? I think I like those ideas. I'm looking at this building, I can't help myself and thinking like, it does neither of those things.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I think, we can look at, like literally countless examples of buildings, I would say particularly from the past 50 years, that really are about short-term gain. They don't take into consideration the potential for adaptive reuse in the future. You're not thinking about, they've simultaneously kind of lost a sense of grandiosity as well as losing any sense of the future, and it's such an interesting point. Like I was speaking to Stephen earlier this week and saying that, we went before times, right before the pandemic, I went on a gallery tour in West Chelsea, and walking around that neighborhood, I sort of had the sense like, this sort of feels like New York, but I could be anywhere. It's almost, that whole neighborhood is like a petting zoo for fancy architecture.
Absolutely.
Sort of big name architects.
All the architects.
Right. One of my least favorite words, but I'm glad you brought it up because it's very relevant here. Right. And they've each built a building, a monument to something, themselves or the developer, or whoever. Lots of them are empty. The streets feel absolutely desolate around there.
They're not accessible to most people, right? At all.
The buildings don't relate to one another, and they don't relate to the city, right? They're each a thing unto themselves. So that is like kind of back to that point of architecture as an individual building is absolutely the wrong way to think of it. Like if suddenly architecture is some kind of a vessel for our humanity, an empathetic vessel for our humanity, but also a cell that's a part of a larger organism that then makes up a city, a town, or a community. It's a 180-degree difference in the way we're thinking about these things.
Right. And you have
also goes to the, sorry, Stephen, I'm just going to say, it also goes to the point about who architecture is for, right? These buildings that are just, in that particular instance of West Chelsea, probably the building next to you that's going up, a condo for wealthy people. Again, it's no wonder that probably 99% of the world thinks architecture doesn't matter to them.
Absolutely. And they're getting tax abatements from the cities to keep building them for people who can't afford them.
That's right.
When that's the majority of the city.
Yeah. But I want to, there's tons of buildings being built that aren't by architects. I just came off a Zoom call about a new school that we're looking to, that we're actually about to start design in the beginning of January. And there's questions of how do you make a school that serves Central Brooklyn really represent the community and really create a sense of place for that community that doesn't have, the old New York City school buildings really are a lot about visual control and safety, and really, in some ways, are oppressive to the communities they serve. So just the individual, you have to think about the architecture at different scales. There's a scale of the people within the building and that institution and the cultural goals and the institutional goals and how you can support that. And hopefully they're good goals. Then you jump out and how is the community woven into those set of goals, and how can it support the community, because the people coming in obviously are part of that community. And then you jump out to the scale of the neighborhood or the city, and then how is it helping on that, and then really jump out to the scale of the future of how are we dealing with issues of sustainability and the climate change crisis that we have. How are we making sure that all buildings should do no harm, just fundamentally, and all buildings should make people better and make communities better.
I love that. And I actually, I think about the future that you've just described in kind of two ways. You have the future of the buildings themselves, right? And of that built environment and the city that it creates. But what you got to is like a building is created for the people who utilize it, whether that's residential or commercial or public. It is also therefore created for their future lives, right? Like a kid who grows up going to school, the influence of that building and he and his family, right? And on the community at large has an impact on their future. So in fact, the future of architecture is of the built world, but it is also the urban planning and the design of individual buildings and the way that everything culturally comes together and environmentally comes together to build the future of the human beings who utilize the architecture. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Yeah, and it's the people who, but it is, I would also say that there's a set number of people who utilize any given building on any given day or in any given year. There are exponentially more people who may interact with that building by walking by it, by buying something at the bodega and whatever, who see it on the skyline.
Or the public space that it provides around and outside of the building.
Correct. And, and so that's something that you have to take into consideration as well. I mean, I think, what Stephen raises is, for me, kind of what I grapple with every day as a PR person who works in architecture, the kinds of work that the media tends to focus on is the opposite of what we're advocating for here, right? They are looking at the work of the architects, the sort of the forms, right?
The buzz.
The Bilbaos. What did you say?
The buzz.
Right. And what is that thing that's going to leap off the page? And I think what we're saying is that, the kinds of work that we should be interested in, the kinds of work that we should be promoting, the kinds of work that we should be reading more about is the work that's more complex, that maybe is a little less, zoomy, sort of in terms of the way it appears on the page of a magazine. And that just has a much more profound sense of all kinds of responsibilities, social, economic, environmental, et cetera. And it requires us, I think, to collectively tell a different kind of story about architecture, and to be willing to not only tell that story, but to listen to that story as well. A story that isn't so easily consumed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's not that I think our building should be beautiful, and form should, and we're not saying form isn't important and beauty is important. I think beauty is part of the culture, and how it and also sends messages. There's symbols within buildings themselves, but we're saying it is a sort of complex organism. If you almost think of, a really wonderful novel that has so many plots and ideas layered into it over the course of the novel, that it is complex and it can't be broken down into these small things. And if you think of it oversimplified in the design process, then you still have people in engaging the building in complex ways, but maybe you're undermining the best that you can get out of that design, the best you can get out of architecture.
There's so many directions that this conversation could go. I mean, from the technical of like, what's the future of the technical build world? I mean, the tools and the materials and that. There's also, I think, a question here in my mind that you guys keep kind of, I'm not saying you're dancing around it, but it feels to me like city planning, urban planning, the role of government in partnership in urban development, and not just urban, suburban, rural, whatever, exurban, is so important. The infrastructure piece of this, as well as the planning guidelines. Can we touch on those two things each as you guys feel comfortable?
Sure. I mean, the infrastructure, again, I think that when you're investing money in things, it needs to do at least 4 or 5 things really well. If you're making a highway, if you're making a sort of, a bus station, whatever piece of infrastructure, a train station, it can't just do the immediate job, right? Because you're putting so much into it and there's so much opportunity for it to do more. So you really need checklists. Is it operating on as many levels in the most positive way, in a way to both benefit society as well as the day-to-day intended use?
I love that. I love that. And do we see a future shift in kind of the way that we get guidelines and guidance on that from government, or is this really going to be beholden on the developers and the designers?
I mean, I think that is, it's changing in ways, right? Like we see, new laws around environmentalism, right? Like think of things like Local Law 97, right? There's any one of a number of laws we could point to. But the fact is that those kinds of things come in piecemeal ways, right? There's something on the environment, there may be something on equity, there's something on something else, right? And I personally think that there's going to have to be a shift in the profession, and probably even like thinking about the way architects are educated, that moves them towards the realization that architecture equals citizenship, right? That it kind of becomes that simple, right? That the role of the architect is so critical and so important to the way our lives are shaped, right? There's that famous Winston Churchill quote about, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us, right? That is so, that kind of thing has always driven me, right? As a student of architecture and now in my career, like the importance of architecture for me cannot be overstated. So to be able to teach architects in that way, right, that it is no longer just about aesthetics, right? I read a quote from a dean in thinking about this interview that said aesthetics are out and equity is in. And I actually don't agree with that, right? I think equity is in. I don't think aesthetics should ever be out. But the point is that aesthetics are not it, right? Aesthetics, all of this has to happen, and it has to happen under the umbrella of aesthetics.
It's like what you were saying in West Chelsea, right? I mean, it's like, it's like it can't just be the design on its own for the aesthetic output, which is what most human beings think about architecture as.
That's right. And beauty has to matter, and beauty has to be accessible, right? And that's what I see where the shift, I think, has to happen. And so it's a lot of a mindset, I think, that the architect has to bring. And yes, maybe they have to bring the client along with them, but there are also very enlightened clients who are already thinking this way.
Yeah.
So it is happening, right? It's just happening in small ways. I think people are just increasingly realizing that our resources are not unlimited, and their financial resources, natural resources, temporal resources, all
human resources,
all of them, right? They are not unlimited, and architecture has to contribute to the solution, or else it's part of the problem. And I think it's just that simple.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. There is this thing in architecture, I think, that is really unfair, and I'll say unfair, which is the education. And you touched on it a little bit. I mean, architects have to study, and I know this personally because for whatever reason, I have a lot of architects in my life. I've always thought it's because they're both equally left and right brained, and I am also, but I don't know the reason other than that. My great grandmother was an architect, so maybe. But I think the what's that?
She must have been an early architect.
Yeah. She was the first female professional landscape architect in the country.
Wow.
And she designed the gardens at Mount Vernon.
Oh,
like the redesign.
I was just reading about her. That's crazy. Okay, sorry, but that's off topic. But that's
fine. We're gonna go. Her maiden name is my middle name, so we'll come back to that. But yeah, no, it's always been in my life. But I think the education is so unfair. The continuous education, while it's necessary from the technical standpoint, I get it. No other. I mean, other than what, like, I don't know, lawyers, doctors, maybe
medicine, doctors. Yeah, doctors have that.
And yet the divide between your liability and your income from an architect, unless you're a star architect. No, sorry, Stephen, I don't mean to like put you on the spot on this one, but it's just not reasonable. Like, do we see a future of architecture when it becomes more democratized, that you also get some reward for the architects and the incredibly important role that they're playing in the built world, and which is the world and our lives?
I guess I'm going to jump one step behind that for a second and say expanding the role of who is an architect right now, right? And I think that architecture is a really narrow profession right now. In order to do architecture that really represents the people they're designing for, you need a much more diverse group of people doing so. And connected with that, we need to make sure they can make a living wage and they can make money and that they're properly compensated for the work that they do. And so that's a sort of expanding, more expansive role, both of what we're demanding from the built environment and the people who are designing it.
Yeah, totally fair. Totally fair.
I think part of it is in part of the conversation, and really my life's work is about educating people on the importance of architecture and therefore the importance of the architect, right? And that, because architecture is so misunderstood, I think there is this, particularly in this country. I mean, there are countries in the world, and Japan comes to Germany, Italy, right, where the architect is revered. And I don't mean that to sound like idolatry in any way, but like there's understanding, like just in the way that we understand that medical doctors have our lives in their hands, to a certain extent, architects do too, right? And the buildings they build can quite literally kill you, right, if they're not done well, but they can also hurt your soul, right, if they're not done well.
Or expand your possibility.
Right, or the opposite, right? And so, trying to, through my work, make that clearer has been what's driven me, right, for so many years. But I think, I think you're right that like that really does have to change at a certain point, because there is a huge gulf between the responsibility that comes with being an architect and the way architects are respected and compensated.
Absolutely. Well, I'm watching time, and again, yet another topic I could geek out on for hours and hours. Is there anything else as we think about the future of architecture? Is there a time in the future, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, when you guys hope that we can achieve it and look back and say, we really achieved these things that we are talking about today, and what that looks like?
Well, I think the time, because of climate change, the time is now for some things. You literally, buildings use 40% or are responsible for 40% of the carbon in the United States. The time is now to start doing that. And one hopes within 5 or 10 or 15 years, with some of the conversations that have been happening this summer as well, that architecture really moves to a more expansive understanding of its role and its importance.
That's great. Cool.
I guess I would just answer that by saying that I think when we start to see fewer of the kinds of projects where you can just look at them and say a lot of money and a lot of materials were wasted on that, to a time where we see buildings that feel like they give back to us rather than just taking, right? Where there's just a different kind of a model, a regenerative model instead of an extractive model. When we start to see that being the majority of buildings built, then I think we'll be in a good place.
Excellent. You guys, both of you, Stephen, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on Future of XYZ and talking about the future of architecture. It was enlightening, and I really look forward to that future. It's a good one to be more inclusive, to take care of social and to take care of environmental. It's really the only path.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
It's only 15 minutes, but it was so fun.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.